embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone to the final session in the 12th annual Dasra Philanthropy Week. A very good evening to those logging on from Asia, and a very good morning to all our other global participants. The theme for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving, and DPW marks the beginning of this movement that each of us must make our own. If there is one takeaway that we would like you to walk away with through our session today, as well as dialogues across the week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy to talk not only about surviving, but also thriving. And that we can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when each of us embraces a strong lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all our work. Our session today focuses on how data can help the vulnerable thrive and the power in shifting the conversation from data owners to data users. We have a great lineup of speakers today. And to start us off, I would like to introduce Vandana Chandani, Head of Corporate Philanthropy for Bloomberg LP in Asia Pacific. Over to you, Vandana.
Thank you, Urmi. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time to be a part of this dialogue as we at Bloomberg officially launched Data for Good Exchange in India in partnership with Dasra. Thank you also to Society Platform, our knowledge partner, and Stanford PAX, our academic partner for this project. By the way, before I go into any details, I think that video was amazing and such a wonderful way to start off the evening. The Data for Good Exchange will focus on a series of thought leadership conversations, culminating in a conference, which we hope we can host in person in Q4 this year. Through this, we endeavor to bring to life a year-long vision of fostering collaboration between key stakeholders and redefining India's data narrative, placing the vulnerable at the center of it to really help India thrive. 2020 has been a year defined by meeting the moment. And many have honestly remarked that they'd like to forget 2020 ever happened. But if you think about it, there probably has never been a year more important to remember and to learn from, at least in our lifetime. As India suffered the impact of COVID-19 through the last year, one of the most visible gaps was the lack of good quality data that could have been leveraged to tackle the crisis, which has hence prompted an increased interest amongst nonprofits, funders, and the government to work towards strengthening the data ecosystem for India's development sector. There is therefore a real need and opportunity to bring together the best minds to not only share and learn from their collective experience, but also to come together as a community to create and support solutions for greater impact. At Bloomberg, data is at the core of everything we do, as is giving back to the communities in which we live and work. We have long advocated for using data science to solve societal problems. This is, in fact, the ethos of our annual Data for Good Exchange conference in the US since 2014, bringing together experts and innovative thinkers from the public and private sectors to share insights and new ideas for harnessing modern machine learning and data science methods to improve civic and social outcomes. Earlier in January this year, we started the Data for Good Exchange India conversation, which brought to light the importance of making data more accessible to empower the country's most vulnerable communities, with a focus on three critical areas: data for health, data for learning to livelihoods, and data for urban resilience. Some of you may have had the opportunity to go through the landscape study that Dasra has just released. If not, please do take the time to review it through the Dasra website. The study talks about enabling data empowerment for India's most vulnerable and goes into great detail on why we are starting this conversation about data for good. Some of the most worrying trends highlighted in this report are the pandemic has caused the largest global economic contraction in 80 years, and as many as 124 million new global poor have been induced in 2020. Worryingly, 60% of these folks live in South Asia. The pandemic has also amplified the inequalities further in India, straining our efforts to create a more equitable growth for the most vulnerable communities in the country. India now faces a shortfall in 10 of the 17 SDGs, which includes zero hunger, good health, and gender equality. We've also found that the urban poor as well as the rural poor has not really undertaken and been a part of the urban revolution that is taking place with the internet and data, even though that is booming across the country. So really what I'm trying to say here is that while we are on a trajectory of growth, there is a large population of marginalized, vulnerable communities in India that is not a part of this growth trajectory and is being left behind. So more than ever before, it is time to come together as a community to help India thrive. And with that, I'd like to hand over to the Chief Curator of Societal Platforms, Sanjay Purohit, to take this conversation forward. Sanjay, over to you, everyone. Thank you for being a part of this dialogue, and we look forward to an enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vandana, for setting us off on this exciting evening together. It's a privilege to co-create this journey along with Dasra, Bloomberg, and the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford PAX. It's truly an honor. We're very excited to work with some such amazing people like Vandana, Neera, Anand, Lucy, and the whole team. So looking forward to the evening together. My intent today is to raise more questions, open the frame for conversation, because we have some amazing speakers and discussions following this short introduction. The landscape report that Vandana mentioned is an important beginning. I certainly urge you to reflect on it. We have looked at more than 10 models that have used data innovatively to address the needs of the most vulnerable and the citizens across India. We have tried to identify certain breakpoints, certain questions, potential responses, and I'm sure you would find a lot of interesting threads that we could follow through as the journey unfolds over the year ahead. Anthropologist Gregory Bateson once said, "Information is the difference that makes a difference." And I think that's a very important element that we should unpack today and through this journey of data for good exchange. Our endeavor is to focus on data, the building block of information, and explore how we can use it to make a difference at scale. Now, I would like to certainly begin this conversation today with a short video. I'll request you to reflect on this short video from eGov Foundation, which is one of the models we learned from during our landscape study. Requesting the team to play the video, please.
చూడండి చెత్తాచెదారం ఎట్లా ఉన్నాయో రోడ్లు మొత్తం ఇది చేసుకుంటా ఈగలు దోమలు ఇది చేసుకుంటా ఎవరి కాళ్ళు శుభ్రత పాటించుకుంటా ఇది చేసుకుంటా ఉంటే చాలా బాగుంటుంది. చూడండి ఎంత బ్యాడ్గా ఉందో, ఎంత బ్యాడ్ స్మెల్ వస్తుందో.
This Puraseva mobile application, which has been developed with the E-Government Foundation, is indeed a powerful tool in the hands of citizens, because that's one platform wherein all kinds of services are made possible, and in the whole process, citizens have been thoroughly empowered.
So the heart of it is citizens. So we give citizens tools and access to services in a very, very transparent and efficient manner. So you can see where your particular case is, where your particular request is. For the first mile employees, the actual people who do the actual job, we create a direct link between the service request and what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. And for the city administrators, they need data to make better decisions. So we give a combined picture to them to make better decisions for the cities. Our hope is that by using a standard open platform, there'll be millions of people participating and building applications and solutions in their own way, in their own context. A person in Ranchi can solve the local problem much better than a person in Bangalore. Okay, so it should be easy enough for a 14-year-old kid in Ranchi to make an application for public grievance, using our platform. So that's our dream.
కంప్లైంట్ ఇచ్చిన వెంటనే సమస్యను పరిష్కరించారు. చాలా సంతోషంగా ఉంది. ఒక చిన్న సమస్య అయినా ఈ కంప్లైంట్ పరంగా మా ఏరియాకి ఒక మంచి పని చేశానన్న ఆనందం నాకు చాలా సంతోషంగా ఉంది.
So to kick off the conversation, the point that I want to highlight from this quick snippet is the big question is, how do you bring data into the life and flow of people's everyday events? It is not about collecting data and creating sophisticated synthesis and analytics. That's for the side. But the real question is, how do you bring it into the day-to-day activities of people? You heard the term first mile and not the last mile, because most of the time we defer to people as saying, we have to reach the last mile. And I think we have to invert that question and saying, how do we begin from first mile? The community, the people, the most vulnerable of the society are the first mile of the question rather than the last mile of the question. And of course, the question of visibility. If I can see things, then there's a higher probability that I can solve, or at least I can see whether it is being solved. These are some of the questions that started unfolding in our mind. And we started sort of rethinking, who is the center of this conversation? Who is the you and who is the I? I think that's an important question for all of us to deliberate. Who is you and who is I? Because the moment you take the conversation from the center of the community, then the I is the community, is the people. I know I always have this anecdote that I share with people. There was a time when I would drive with these massive AAA maps, right, which had this Cartesian coordinate sort of things, ABCD on one side, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the other side, and try to locate the route. This was way before any of us saw all the good stuff on the Google Maps, etc. And you always could locate yourself in A6, C9, something like that, right? So you're saying this is where you are. And then comes digital, and suddenly you are this blue dot, which is always in the center of the screen. And so the whole reference changed. Instead of the screen being the fixed and you being the variable, you became the fixed and the screen became the variable. And I think that's the question that we have to answer from data for good exchange perspective, is that how do we create a narrative where the people whom we are trying to serve are the center and everything else is with reference to that, rather than everything else is an ecosystem and we try to place people into that ecosystem. I think that's a question that we are trying to explore through this conversation. If you look at the history of civilization, we have been through some important transitions. The first round of civilization of humanity happened when we learned how to move matter, how to move things, right? An agricultural revolution happened. Then we learned how to move energy. That's when the industrial revolution happened. And then we learned how to move information. And that's when the knowledge revolution happened, right? And of course, in 1905, Einstein connected the matter and energy as the two things that were connected. And then Lizard in 1929 connected energy and information, which were connected. And we said there are three building blocks of civilization: matter, energy, and information. Let's talk about the development narrative, how we are focused on the societal development narrative. And it seems to be sort of stuck in moving matter and moving energy. And we are still not too sure, too clear, too certain, too solid on how moving information is the one that's transforming the landscape of development. In Data for Good Exchange, our intent is to open the discussion and get the questions right on how moving information is the next important step in reshaping the way we look at development and services for the most vulnerable in our respective communities. As I was trying to unpack this question, of course, I came across some very good learnings from Amartya Sen, who said that development consists of the removal of various types of unfreedoms that leave people with little choice and little opportunity of exercising their reasoned agency. And I think the big word here is reasoned agency. And data plays a very important role in being the resource for reasoning, for being the resource in thinking through. And so today I would like to draw your attention to three aspects of this resource: ownership to essentially enable freedom, capacity to exercise freedom, and agency to do that at our own will. And I think let us spend a few moments reflecting on these three dimensions: ownership, capacity, and agency. Of course, there's a lot of debate and discussion going on around ownership of data. And the narrative has been slowly moving across different domains, starting from the institution owns the data and the institution derives the benefit, which essentially is the capture model of data as to how the data is captured for the benefit of few. A lot of work over the last few years has happened in saying the institute owns the data, but opens it for individual benefit, and the whole evolution of the thinking around the commons. I think it's important to see whether we can push the narrative even further, where the individual owns the data for individual benefit, which is the whole empowerment model or the data empowerment model going into the future. Of course, some work has been happening on that front. I would urge you to look up the data empowerment and protection architecture, the guidelines for which were published by Niti Aayog in India. It has some very interesting design guidelines. There are 11 important design guiding principles as to how do you design data for empowerment and protection. I would like to certainly draw your attention to three. One, reimagining what is user control. What is the meaning of informed consent? How do you really rethink and do that in a very much more thoughtful and intelligent way? Second, what is the design of data minimization so that you collect the minimum required, most important data and do that very thoughtfully rather than just because the vulnerable do not know what you will do with the data, is that you go ahead and collect relentless, reckless amounts of information. And third important aspect is the whole guideline around interoperability, because making data interoperate amongst various systems is a very important element of making this work in the benefit of the society. So how do you make it interoperable rather than create more and more data silos over time? And I think there have been different models in the way people have thought about data empowerment. I think there are economies which thought that data is a capital good, and hence we should look at how do you capitalize. The economies which thought that data is to be not used for anything, completely protected, completely closed. There are economies that thought that data is good for surveillance. But I think in India, we have to think about data as a very important foundation for democracy, a very important foundation for empowering the people because of the good it can do in serving the most vulnerable. So the rethink point I want to place for you is, what is the meaning of ownership in the context that we all work in? I would also like to reflect on the second point, which is capacity of the people to exercise their freedom. Now, again, the narrative is moving. So there was a narrative around data saying, you can see what is happening because of all the dashboards and all the analytics and all the great stuff that you have put together, and you can solve the problem. And I think that's a very control-oriented improvement or change narrative, because very few people can see what's the issue and very few people can do something about it. But then we progressed. And we progressed to a point saying, I can see, but you can solve, which is the request model of change or request model of freedom, right? Saying, I can see the problem. And some of you saw in the video that we saw today, saying, I can see the problem and I can request for change. But I think it's important to push the narrative even further, where I can see and I can solve my problem. And that's a very important element. And I need to get that visibility into where is my life, my journey, my agency in this whole. So I think, how do you build capacity of people to see, make sense, and act on things in the interest. And at Societal Platform, we worked on this to create 9 design principles as to what does it take to create these kind of systems. I would not go into the 9. Let me highlight 3. 1, how do you design for observability? How do you improve people's ability to see? Right. Second is, how do you design for heterogeneity? How do you create diverse context? Because India is such a diverse context across language, socioeconomic backgrounds, political landscape that we deal with, demographics that we deal with. So how do we embrace heterogeneity rather than try to standardize and make everybody fall into one defined bracket? And the third important aspect is actionability, is to, can I act on the data? Or is that it will be collected from me? I am the provider of the resource, but somebody else will act on the data, right? And I think that is an important question that we need to really. So this whole continuum of sense, make sense, and act in my hands is something that we have to evaluate. How are we designing things? These are all design problems. Because if we don't design these things thoughtfully, then the consequences, of course, are ours to bear over time. The third and the last reflection point, or the rethink point I would like to highlight, is agency. I would request the team at Dasra to put up that very interesting picture that we have created for ourselves, which is agency. Where you have said agency is the ability to give every individual a sense of that you have the right data and the metrics to demand tangible impact. That sense of I have, that sense of ownership. But most importantly is then to mobilize it through I can create solutions in my own interest. And if I can do that, then I can unlock my wishes. I can give feedback and inform the policy and budgets which affect my life and my community. And then go on to essentially claim my right to access more information, more data, and take more action. And I think this is a very important virtuous cycle. So if we get the ownership right, if we get the capacity to change right, and if we get the agency right, the intersection of these 3 is something where there is an interesting possibility of designing our responses differently. The last point I want to mention is there are more dimensions of rethink, which I will not touch upon today, but I would request you to touch upon as we go to the rest of the evening. How do we rethink the mechanisms by which we can embed it in our mindset? Do we think like this? How can we make more people think like this? Second is, how do we embed this in our investment thesis? Because philanthropists and different people who are supporting the development narratives, what do we invest in? Do we invest in data so that we can gain more visibility and control? Or do we invest in data so that the vulnerable people get more agency to act on their data? Is it an empowerment narrative or is it a control narrative? Is a question. And that has to go into the way we ask support investments and where do we allow people to work on things, etc. And the third is, how do we embed this into program design? Because there are so many programs, a lot of you on this call run different kinds of programs. How do you bring this thinking into the way you design your programs? So I would request now the team to share another short video to give you a sense of sort of bringing all of this together. Team, can we please play the video?
The Foundation for Ecological Security is involved in conserving forest, land and water resources at local levels for improved ecological, social and economic outcomes. Taking its mission to the next level, FES has developed an initiative called the India Observatory.
Working on forest, land and water resources requires a bird's eye view because these resources are spread across human boundaries, habitations and even districts. Having a spatial view allows you to plan for preservation of certain species, conservation of land and water, and even extraction within permissible thresholds. We all know there are vast sets of data, algorithms, tools being thrown out almost every day by international and national organizations. The question is this data reaching the ground in an intelligible manner? And is such information leading to desirable outcomes on the ground? Some call it the last mile. We call it the first mile because the change actually happens at that level. Village people, block level officers, district level officers.
11 tools have been developed on forests, water and livelihoods which are open source and are essentially aimed at semi-literate people. These tools work offline on smartphones and are available in local languages with easy to interpret codes.
Through the India Observatory Initiative, FES is helping place rich analytics information in the hands of decision makers at various levels. Importantly, it's helping information reach village level people, sarpanch and local level officials so that they can determine their future course of action.
In summary, what I would like to say is that it's time that we think about how to create a data narrative with people at the center, especially the most vulnerable people at the center. How do we think about ownership of data with the individual at the center? How do we think about capacity to use data in the hands of the people who actually want to change their own lives? How do we think about agency such that people can determine action based on their own context and their own will? How do we build this into our mindset, into our investment models, and into our program design? Hopefully, as we deliberate today, we will find some solutions, some answers, but I'm sure there'll be more to come as the year ahead of us unfolds. We look forward to solving this together at scale. Thank you so much. And with that, let me hand over to Anand.
Thanks, Sanjay. And it's always fascinating to hear this narrative and hear it from you. And really, before going to the next section, just one quick point of reflection is, as we heard from Sanjay, there is so much that India is doing. We saw the FES story, Jagdish spoke about that. And there are many, many such great examples. And the good thing about India is scale, right? You cannot solve any problem in India if you're not already thinking scale. So I think there is one part, speaker before me, who's basically Sanjay's been dealing with scale and how to solve things at scale around this, and especially around agency. I will be quickly going on to a speaker from US, Lucy, who's going to speak a little bit about how she thinks about this globally, what are the learnings. But just before that, a few sobering statistics. And, again, it's in the report and please do read up on that. But just if you can put up the first slide with just the circle, Tanisha. And as we put this up, our going in hypothesis was, look, as we look at models, and I'm not talking about all models which use data for the vulnerable or for the social sector. I'm talking about literally the best, most effective models. So we ended up looking at over 30 models in different sectors like health, education, etc. And what we found was, quite revealing. We found that, if you were to think of the first circle, like how many models actually address that question, which is I have the data and I know the metrics. I know exactly where I'm standing today. Only 65%. I say only 65% because how do you navigate a Google Maps if you don't know where you stand today? As you go to the second question, which is I can replicate locally. I can copy with pride. I can share with my neighbors and I can create local innovations. How many models allow fearless local replication at scale? Only 50%. If you go to the next one, which is I wish the data which I'm seeing actually leads to some feedback loops happening. A great example is how our school teachers in government schools have to give tons and tons of data, filling up huge amounts of data, potentially without feedback loops operating. Only 35%. That means, only 1 in 3 models, the best models, actually have feedback loops built in. And then if you go to the last circle, which is I claim, which is, look, I found value in data for creating impact. I want more data. Only 20%. So the reality is even the best models have a lot to go. And that is the challenge. And hence, and if you go to the next slide, please, how can we learn from India? How can we learn from the best? And really, it's my privilege to welcome Stanford, Pax, and Lucy, who's really the director at the center, so at the Digital Civil Society Lab, and really one of the thinkers who's pushing the boundaries of how can data actually serve the vulnerable? What are the things which won't work? What are the mistakes which we should not be making? And what are the opportunities out here? And as we think about this, I'd love to hear, Lucy, you speak a little bit about your perspectives, but also share a little bit about how India could think of this journey and potentially leapfrog a few generations as it thinks about that. And then I'd love to bring up a few questions and really have a dialogue. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anand. And thank you so much to Dasra and everyone for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm calling in from California on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people. It's early in the morning here, so it's delightful to be here. If we could go to the other slide deck and to the next slide. I am really excited about this opportunity to learn with you all. Let me just situate my perspective on some of these issues. I run something called the Digital Civil Society Lab, which we founded at Stanford in 2014. And it was in an felt early at the time recognition that both civil societies and democracies really depend on digital systems now. They're not optional. They're not add-ons. They're fundamentally the ground on which we're standing. And so how they work and who designs them profoundly shape two very critical things, both what individuals can do and what communities can do, and how individuals can come together. And that there's a really important through line from what Sanjay was saying about the questions of ownership. And I think these are questions, this is one of the questions that we will be collectively answering and redesigning. It's entirely likely that within a decade, in fact, I would bet on this, that we'll be talking about this in a very different way and we'll be operating in a very different ecosystem. So I want to say right up front that I think there are two key areas to add to those that Sanjay has mentioned that I'm going to be trying to talk about and explain why I think that India is as likely to be where we will build and find these answers, probably more likely than other places on the planet. The first is that we need, but don't yet have, a truly collective approach to understanding data and data rights and data governance. We still talk about individuals and individual data and my data versus institutional data. And I want to talk about why that's may not be the right, I don't think is the right frame for this conversation. And then the second thing I want to speak to are these lessons that Anand and Sanjay have mentioned that speak to the last quote on this slide, that data cannot be owned but must be governed. And that is to say that I think investments in something called Data for Good, built around this empowerment cycle, which is quite exciting. I hadn't seen anything like it until I saw the report. Still may be too small an aperture for what we're really after, which is that this is not about data so much as it is about the infrastructure and the governance systems we build in order to pursue and embed our democratic ideals. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I want to first talk about individuals and collectives. No matter where you are in the world in 2021, even those of us in California where the electrical grid is unreliable, where the Wi-Fi is unstable, although California doesn't like to advertise itself that way, trust me, that's what we're living in. There are certainly places on the world where access is less available, but we live in a life, our lives have been datafied. We're either actively generating and putting out data that reflects us in the ways that this picture shows, knowingly or unknowingly, with almost all of our interactions throughout the day and night, and these insights and these vectors that I show here attached to this individual, we're either aware that we're generating this or we're not. but it is being generated by the way we use our cell phones, let alone all the other systems that are now connected to us digitally. And so there are physical versions of ourselves and there are datafied versions of ourselves. And that's important for each of us to understand. And there are things that we can do as individuals to seek to take advantage of this information, seek to use it to purposes that we control. And I think those are all of the aspirations that Sanjay alluded to. But if you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that we also have to recognize that those individual datafied selves, not all, they don't add up arithmetically to being able to see a community in data. It's a much more complicated mathematical feat, because the data on me, in almost all cases, whether we're talking about my communications data, data generated from my employment history, data generated by where I go every day, or even if I were to be fortunate enough to use one of the apps, for example, that was just highlighted in those very interesting videos, and submit a ticket to my local government about a public service act, that data is in fact also reflects the relationship with whoever I've sent it to or who's ever collected it. So it is never only just mine. It is almost always in relationship to another person, another institution. And so there's this community perspective of data that we need to understand is both visible in the aggregate of individual data, but also that every point of individual data, be it, again, my text messages reflect my relationship to whoever I'm sending it to, and it's as much theirs as it is mine, or my biometric identity card, that my biometrics, my DNA is not just mine. It crosses generations, it speaks to my ancestors, it speaks to my progeny. So there's very little data in the digital environment that is truly individual, yet we do need and we do have individual rights, and these have shaped much of the conversation to date about governing data. We have used, for example, individual privacy and built entire digital rights agendas around individual privacy that are very important, don't get me wrong, but I think they are too narrow. They are what we don't have, and what I think these efforts in India, and as you're building and thinking about this ecosystem and community of data for good, if you go to the next slide, please, what we need to understand is that this virtual cycle of data and its focus on the individual gets us a long way from where we are. And it's a critical advance to recognize that there are vulnerable and marginalized people in societies around the globe who have not been centered as they should. And in addition, we need to understand and build systems that recognize and respect the relational nature of the data that we're talking about here. So while we're talking about individual people, the digitized data is itself reflective almost always of some kind of relational interaction. And that requires a great new deal of thinking that goes well beyond data science. We're talking now in the realm of human rights and governance and democracy and democratic principles. And those two must be built in at the very core of what we're after. If you'd go to the next slide, please. So as we pursue these aspirations of data for good, and some of these points Sanjay and Anand also mentioned, it really does require not just expanding what has already been built, but rethinking how we build and how and who is included. And by the who, I mean not just individuals and but entire communities who will have the kind of agency and control that Sanjay was speaking of. It speaks to how we collect the data. It speaks to this need to really conceptualize and protect collective rights. And it ultimately, or perhaps initially, speaks to the political economy of our digital systems. Who builds them? Who owns them? and who governs them. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm very excited to see how this plays out in India. I've had the great good fortune to learn from Sanjay and his work over the last couple of years. But I also think for all of us, as we're thinking about this, there's a couple of fundamental assumptions we've adapted for over the last 20 years that I think we also need to update. The first is to think about where is digital. It is, even for those in places where electricity is unreliable and digital systems and digital connectivity is itself unreliable, in an age of national digitized ID, digital is everywhere. It is always on. We as individuals and communities are always generating data. I like to say to people, it's quaint to think that you go online. It's increasingly unlikely that you're ever offline. That has implications for everything from where and how communities can take action to improve their local environment or their local living conditions, to the nature of national security and transnational interactions. It's understanding that, in fact, these digital systems are always on. I highly recommend this book by Laura Denardis at American University, who explains this in detail through the lens of national security. But I think civil society, democracy, and development also needs to quickly realize that this permanent, always-on dependence needs to be factored into every kind of policy making and philosophical approach we can think of going forward. If you go to the next slide, one of the importance of recognizing that we're data generating machines at this point in time is that while we are almost always, as individuals and communities, having data generated from us and about us, we have so very little control or even knowledge of what it is used for. And that speaks not to the ownership of data so much as the governance rules about what can be done with it. What I've shown here, just to give you an example, political micro-targeting is perhaps, I don't know how common this is in India, but in the last election in California in November of last year, there was a proposition on the ballot about the regulation of drivers and delivery people for gig economy apps. And the proposition was a initiative put on the ballot by the companies who build the apps. And it was in response to a previous decision by the legislature to change the rules about how the employees of those companies were regulated. So through the regular democratic process, there was a bill passed and a law put in place. Several companies found it to be not in their interest. They put a ballot proposition on the ballot. They then used all of the data that they had on both the users of their apps and the drivers and delivery people of their apps. They used that data to micro-target political advertisements and mobilize those people to vote through both persuasion and fear. That is the literal creation of an alternative democratic process, invisible to most people, using a resource that was generated for one purpose for a decidedly different purpose. And what it comes down to is not just the data, but who has access and control to it, and to what purposes can they use it. And I think it is those questions we need to ask anytime and every time we are talking about increasing access and understanding of digital data. Is a resource that needs to be governed even while we're trying to figure out this question, or if we're going to continue to pursue this question of ownership. It's really as much a question of use as it is of ownership. If you'd go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of the pervasive nature of data generation, and to recognize again that we are always on, we are always generating this information. who has access to it and what they can do with it is fundamentally the key question. And whether or not we as individuals or communities can ever step out of it is what becomes important. If you go to the next slide, please. Here, beyond data science is recognizing that these data points, these fundamental building blocks of information, as Sanjay put it accurately, are also about relationships. They implicate more than one person at almost all times because of the nature of digital systems. And so the question becomes, how are we governing relationships? And who is at the center of those decisions, and who has access and use to this information? And that's where the rules become very important. If you go to the next slide, please. There are emerging around the world fundamental new approaches to this. The Digital Civil Society lab that I run thinks about these 3 specific domains. I want to just give you examples from 2 of them that I think may help us find our way forward. The next slide, please. Here are some familiar to you probably examples of how technologists are taking on these challenges and seeking to find ways to build digital systems that are by design respectful of individual rights to control the use of this information about their relationships. The newest, you'll see the Firefox logo, which is an open source browser, the Signal logo, which is an encrypted messaging app. And then in the middle is Almond, which is an effort to create in real time, because the need to do this is critical, an open source voice assistant ecosystem as we are rapidly moving from a text-based interface, text and visual interface to the internet, to voice acted interface with the internet, which holds extraordinary potential to bring into this space communities who speak languages that have been otherwise ignored, or reasons that haven't yet met commercial purposes, to have an opportunity to truly make the internet a space that many more people, regardless of literacy levels, can participate in. There is going to need to be a non-proprietary voice assistant approach. So we need new technological opportunities to really create democratic access, if you go to the next slide. But I think even as important, if not more important, particularly for this audience, are the need to really imagine new governance logics. This picture comes from Mozilla. It gives you a sense of some of the ideas that are out here. I think we are actually in the governance innovation decade. And that's why I said at the top that I think by 10 years from now, we'll be talking about very different kinds of organizations than what we think of now. We tend now to think of commercial companies, not-for-profit organizations, and government agencies. There will be a whole new slew of institutional structures built around some mix, I can't predict the future, but some mix of these different choices. If you go to the next slide, please, what you'll see here are 5 different examples of institutional efforts to embody those governance frames mentioned earlier. And each of these is in some way shaped by the recognition that data are relational, that there are 2 or more human beings associated with almost every data point, and that controlling and using that information of them and about them requires fundamentally new institutions, which we don't have now, but we are beginning to see some of these emerge on the landscape. There's an effort called the Open Collective. There are civic data trusts. There's a variety of different data collaboratives. And then the bottom right hand there is a picture of what might become data coalitions. And it's entirely likely that we will see international trade, local government, whatever version of the new social contract is being developed in democracies is going to be built around some mix of these kinds of institutions. So if you go to the next slide, please, finally, and my final point is I think it is really in places like India where you are taking on this work at a scale that's unimaginable in the United States, to be quite frank. But I want to focus your attention as you go forward on the need to think as hard and as thoughtfully about the governance methods and the organizational forms that you'll be inventing as much as about the data itself. Thank you very much. It's a joy to be here with you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Lucy. And I was taken by that visual you had in terms of what the future will look like. And I'm reminded of the saying, right, which is the short term we'll be wrong. In the long term, it's more likely we'll be right. And some of these changes will be profound. Before getting a few questions, I did want to play back a question which we're hearing from audience, which is, as philanthropists, and there are many philanthropists in the room from India and abroad, how should they think about investments that they make in data? And today, a lot of the investments they make for data for the nonprofits are, in want of a better word, if I can use a crude term, they're very command and control. The term M&E, measurement and evaluation, just sounds like a prehistoric term. It's amazing it continues still now, but it does. And many of the investments, Lucy, are also very proprietary. Each NGO is, that's maybe. So, in your view, what would be one thing which philanthropists keep in mind as they make investments will help at least engage them in a conversation around this? And also, what is that one thing which maybe they have to start changing behaviors? What would that be, according to you?
I think if you took the virtuous cycle of data empowerment, replace the I's with we's, and recognize that it is the community that you wish to serve that needs to be driving this, that's the change I would make. So how does that change? That can, depending on how the philanthropist currently does their work, can mean an entirely different means of engagement with them. It's high. Well, I'll tell you what but really designing, letting the community tell you what the challenge is, all the way through, not just what data mechanisms you might bring in, what kind of data literacy efforts might be necessary there, but what problem you're addressing, and ultimately through to this governance. What is going to happen with this data beyond just this initial use, and listening to that community and supporting them to do, as you say, perhaps make some mistakes in the short term, but find their way through in the long term. All of those ideas, I'll say, especially that data governance slide, if you have a chance to look at it in more depth, you'll notice that it refers to things like indigenous data traditions. The world is full of communities that know how to manage knowledge in communal ways.
Yeah.
Full of them. The tech industry and capitalism don't necessarily know how to do that, but that knowledge exists, and we're here. We need to build on it and use it in the digital age.
Thanks, Lucy. That's a powerful thought. Putting the community in the center, and maybe starting with the question of what exactly would help you and what would you want. It's amazing how few times communities come directly into the center of data investments today. Firstly, thank you, but please hold on, and it'll be great to hear some thoughts as you hear some of the Q&A. But I'd love to call on Priyank, and Priyank Hirani, who really has been helping and consulting with the Rockefeller Foundation's Asia Regional Office on data and tech efforts. Priyank, if you're there, love to get a perspective from you from a funder lens. And two questions in one. One is, what do you think is working, right? You have been not only doing this at Rockefeller, but also having discussions with other funders on this topic. So what's working on this? But also, what would be one roadblock that you find comes in the way of this becoming a very mainstream topic? And talk a little bit about how has the journey been for you on this topic, Priyank?
Sure. Thanks so much, Anand, and thanks for having me here. It's been quite a journey for us in thinking about sort of data for social impact or data for development, and the questions of data governance, right? And putting communities right at the center of the issue is something that Rockefeller Foundation has been doing in all of its work. So one of the examples that I can give you in terms of how we are looking at having communities at the center of the questions around making data work for them is our work with the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, where here's an organization that has data from its most vulnerable women farmers, and they want to look at how can they solve the data puzzle for data to work for the women themselves. So rather than data for reporting, this is about data for decision-making, and decision-making by putting the agency back into the hands of the women farmers. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry. So this is one example where we've been looking at the question of data. On data governance, I think the journey for an organization to move from data sharing to data governance to data stewardship, actually. And I was glad about a lot of the stuff that Lucy spoke of, which relates to the questions around data stewardship models. And it's important to look at the purpose for the specific data stewards and see what value is being derived for different stakeholders. And some of the work that we have started doing is with the Apti Institute on looking at health data stewardship models in India, and how can those really learn from the examples that are available more globally and contextualize for India. Because there's also not, and this relates to the sort of the roadblock that I see, that there's no sort of central definition around what some of these aspects are. So for example, within the health context, the differentiating between personal data and personal and sensitive data and non-personal data, and then some of the fears in terms of data sharing, because we don't have the understanding of these differences become quite apparent. One of the things that we have done with some of the other funders is we've started creating a safe space for funders to come together and talk about data and tech. And as you pointed out, there are a number of these issues that we are not aware of as funders. So we've created this platform where funders come and discuss around what are the challenges that they are facing, and data governance being one of the major issues to be thinking about. So yeah, I'll stop there and then back to you.
No, thanks, Frank. And just a question on that. And in a way, I'm reminded of sometimes when one doesn't have clarity about what are the boundary conditions, one tends to be overcautious, right? And it's very easy sometimes to take a call saying, let's be safe. And what that translates very quickly in the context of India is then let's not share. And let's just play it safe. So in a way, as you think about one Monday morning action that a philanthropist could take, what would that be? And the reason that Monday morning action would be interesting is you've already taken many of them. So what would be one initial step which can start, helping people unpeel this a little, even if they are, funders in their individual capacity? Yeah.
So, that's a great question. And one of the things that I can think of is sort of creating this awareness around the benefits of data governance, right? So instead of being scared of the unknown, it is about creating more awareness and educating sort of all these different stakeholders that are relevant for this conversation on what could be the positive externalities through proper data governance. And also then looking at sort of what are the different mechanisms available. So what are the different models available for the specific benefit that they intend to derive from the kind of data governance.
So thanks. That sounds interesting. And also, I guess a collective voice will give more confidence as well. It's unlikely everyone will make the same mistake altogether. So no, thanks, Priyank. I'd love to go to Dr. David Peters, and David, you're the faculty co-chair for the Johns Hopkins India Institute, amongst many roles that you play. You did join the January session when we launched the report, and you said something interesting, I remember, which is, how can data be used for, empowering and incentivizing, and not for fear and building walls. And, the whole story about how Johns Hopkins has helped share data about COVID, helped share data about how it's spreading, and also, how things are working, but also creating a global picture stands out, at least, as an outsider, as a great example of what can happen if data actually leads to more awareness. And of course, now leading into vaccines as well. David, talk a little bit about what's been your experience in the healthcare domain, especially on this, and especially about putting the communities perfectly in the center, and then thinking about what does the data mean for them, but also then how can governance enable such good behavior?
Sure, thanks. And it's really pleased to be here today. I should also recognize that in Baltimore, where our university is based, we are also operating on the unceded and traditional lands of Susquehannock and Piscataway and other indigenous communities. From that position, I think that we note that we have to be recognizing of all of the kinds of stakeholders and marginalized communities that we have around us and around the world. In terms of in terms of the data sharing, I think it's been very important to first of all be able to tap into and make available data. You noticed you mentioned the COVID example in terms of the platform, and that's sort of been a consistent pattern of trying to make data available, but also the code behind these to make it more usable. But that's still to a pretty select audience who have the capabilities to use that. So one of the things that that we've looked at broadly is trying to address these questions of who controls data, who sets the rules, whether it be at local level or at national level. And we like to think that communities and individuals within communities own their own data. So how do you get access to it? Now, again, putting data out is one thing that you need to be pretty sophisticated to be able to use, but often it requires addressing those other issues of agency and capabilities that we're involved with. So often it's about bringing together key actors, and it's about creating their own data and bringing them together. Now, the fortunate part of being an academic is that you can bridge some of these communities, and it's particularly important for government, and particularly in health services, where even if government is not always providing, and it's very mixed across the world, it does have a mandate to oversee. So being able to bring together government and providers and policymakers, decision makers with community representatives, and particularly ways where you bring in marginalized people because they're not always organized. So finding ways to reach, for example, the poorest women in Afghanistan or other communities where you not necessarily easily identifying those that are most vulnerable, to bring them into those kind of settings where, first of all, they get the capabilities to create data, make decisions, ask questions with data, and do so in a way where they are interacting with other key stakeholders that influence their lives, service providers for the most part. So that can be done at local level, it can be done at national and global levels. And the example of COVID is really some of the global common good that I hope that that universities can contribute to, that pretty well everyone can use. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thanks, David. And I think you made a great point, like the role of universities and academia to take self-interest out of the equation, because unfortunately, NGOs have self-interest in this, and so do philanthropists. But maybe there is the role of the academia to take, and that sort of is critical. Otherwise, beyond a point, the government also then comes in with the point of view of what is in it for that party. So again, as this goes ahead, how does that become more critical, becomes useful? Is there one challenge which you encountered, which you can share with the group on, where it was hard to convince either the data owner or the stakeholders from actually working together, and what helped potentially in nudging that or breaking that silo, David?
Yeah, it's unfortunately very common when you have poor service delivery. People are very threatened, and I've seen this both at local levels and at national levels, where government can feel very threatened by this. And often it is a question of building trust over time, and it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes people do get fired, and there are repercussions, particularly in authoritarian regimes. So I have seen that, and I'm not referring to India in this case, but you see it at the local level all the time, because information is power. So partly it is about staying the course, making sure that those that are most marginalized have a voice, and finding non-threatening ways to find common ground. So for example, what we've done is, with community scorecards, you will often have the service providers make their own set of criteria, the intended beneficiaries and users make their own set of criteria and find relatively non-threatening ways to bring them together. And you basically end up having to acknowledge people's different positions of power and that they can be threatened. So I wish there were a good cookbook for it, but it's a lot of learning.
No, thanks, David. It's good to know that there is a way to get this started and bring together closely. Shreya, I wanted to welcome you and really, Shreya, you sort of are leading the work at UChicago, the International Innovation Center. And we're always struck by what the youth can do, and especially in the topic of innovation, and especially because this needs mindsets to change. What would be your sense of, in this journey, what can be the role that young innovators play, and talk a little bit about the fellows, and also, is there a way that young innovators can break some mindsets and actually leapfrog a few decades in this journey, especially in India? Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Anant, for asking this question and having me here. And I really enjoyed Lucy's presentation earlier. And when you talk about youth and youth being really the change for the future, Sanjay earlier talked about capacity that we need. That's, I think, where we're trying to come in. We have this program that we launched last year called the Young Leaders in Tech Policy. And it's really trying to, fulfill the gap that we anticipate. We understand there's going to be data trusts and data governance models that need to come up with the kind of digitization we're seeing in the country today. But where are the young people that are really going to be thinking about filling these gaps? Where is the talent that is going to put into place the governance structures that we're going to require for the technology that's not even been invented today? So that is the program that we launched, is where we want to get young people who are really interested in technology, but also understand the limitations of it, also understand the challenges of working with it, and the fact that we need governance structures around this to be able to create more inclusive, more sustainable technology that is better for everybody and doesn't kind of restrict the growth and development of this country. And working with young people, Anand, has just been fantastic. There's so much passion, there's so much knowledge. They come with so much more learning, their understanding and their willingness to learn more about technology, but also their understanding that, it cannot solve for all problems. And the reality, so a lot of the things that Lucy talked about is things that, these young professionals working in the space of tech policy today understand. But what we want to help them do is really take that understanding and create a program where they can put it to the best effort. Can we match them with organizations such as FES and Civic Data Lab, who are already creating this technology for the communities and data commons, but help that technology think about some of the governance structures that are required today. But not just there, right? Can we also partner with the government directly? Today, we know that the government is creating a large amount of tech products. We're creating digitization systems for health systems, for education. But is there capacity within the government to think about some of these technology governance and tech governance problems that are going to come up in the future? And can we work then directly with the government and through the Young Leaders in Tech Policy or the International Innovation Program to help some of these research that Lucy or David is doing and embed that thinking back into the design of some of the technology that's creating today? And we've been really really surprised and really pleasantly surprised with how well the program has been received. So, with the government, we work directly with the Ministry of Information Technology and embed our fellows there. And they're very open and welcoming to the research and insights that the fellows bring in the creation of some of the designs, including, say, the National AI Center that's going to be launching soon. And similarly, even with civil society, when we work so closely with them and embed our fellows within those programs, we see so much acceptance and so much encouragement and mentorship of young professionals that we see that, tomorrow when we're going to have 20, 100 young fellows, working in this field of tech policy. We'll get there. We'll get there with the support of the community. We'll get there with the support of the philanthropists, and we'll get there with all the passion of the youth that exists today.
No, thanks, Shreya. And that implant model is a very powerful one, because organizations who need this the most, sometimes community-based organizations, may not have the talent needed to actually do some of this. No, so thank you. And I'd love to, with that, bring in, pass the baton to Priya, my colleague from Societal Platforms, and really, Priya, based on some of this, it'll be great for you to moderate the conversation a little bit, bring in some perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the roundtable on creating a data empowerment narrative in India. So this evening, we started hearing from Vandana and Sanjay talking about large data gaps that exist in our ecosystem and how we need to think about using data to empower India's most vulnerable. Then Anand, Lucy, and others shared some interesting viewpoints on how others globally are thinking about building this ecosystem. So in our session, we want to take this conversation further and share with you perspectives from people who are in the forefront of making data work for the most vulnerable groups in India. Through their roles as civil society organizations, or as enablers of the ecosystem, or as funders. I'll introduce them one by one as we go through the session, and I will invite them to share their lived-in experiences, their learnings, and maybe also some open questions that they're still trying to solve. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we will try and respond as much as we can. So I'll start with Pratima Joshi, the founder of Shelter Associates. Shelter Associates have been working on improving the living conditions of the urban poor in India. Pratima, can you give us a quick introduction of your work and how in your world you see data empowering the citizens that you work with, starting with giving them an identity to co-creating good data with the users, and then helping them use that data to demand better services for themselves.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Dasra, for having me on this very, very interesting panel discussion. So Shelter Associates has almost had a 3-decade-long journey in trying to facilitate, very essential services like water, sanitation, and housing for the urban poor. And luckily, very early on in our journey, and I'm talking about nearly 2 decades ago in the late 90s, we realized very quickly that lack of data was one of the major impediments to, efficiently delivering any service on the ground. And so very early on, we've had a data journey now which spans almost 2 decades, where we've been leveraging technology right from GIS to remote sensing to mobile technology, and now we're on to open source. And we have tried along this journey to demonstrate to various urban local bodies how spatial data can become an excellent planning tool in plugging those very critical gaps that exist in delivery of very, very essential services like sanitation and water and solid waste management. But I would like to state here that, when we started off 2 decades ago, we saw a whole bunch of problems that were facing governments. And 2 decades later, they're still facing the same problems. And that is very worrying, because while we've made a leap with technology, you and I use technology every day. I mean, I'm talking of a time when we started using technology when there were no computers, when, the urban local bodies didn't have computers. Most of us were not using mobile as much as we do now. It was not even deeply entrenched at that time. And today, when all of us are using so much of technology, however, cities continue to lack data, which can help them, govern better and help them plug the gaps. So this is where we are. So can
I would love for you to share some examples of transformative change that you have seen when data is available to everyone and is not stuck inside a computer in an office.
That's right. So one of the things that we learned very fast was that, when you talk of data, there is a lot of, suspicion around it, because first of all, there's hardly any data. Even with the government, there is no data. Whatever little there is very outdated, scattered between different departments who don't talk to each other. That is the case even today. But when you talk of doing data, everybody is a little worried. So co-creation becomes the first thing that brings in a certain confidence. So when we do data, the communities is where we start. We start involving the communities and gathering their own data. Then we get the government to validate that data. So today, I'll just give an example. Under the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan for the last 6 years, we've been working across 7 cities of Maharashtra. The first thing we did was we co-created data with them. We mapped all the infrastructure that was available in slums, like drainage networks, water, solid waste management, and everything. We got the municipal corporation to come and take a look at their data, correct it if it was not, if there were errors somewhere, so that they started feeling very confident about it. And since the communities were involved in gathering that data, when it was finally laid out on the table, everybody was comfortable with it. They were confident because they all had participated in creating that. And it led to, a comfort in using it. So what happened was the government leveraged that data and started looking at opportunities where they could start putting in drainage networks. Because when we were doing the One Home, One Toilet program, we found that across cities, sanitation was the most neglected sector. And, less than 20% families living in slums had a home toilet, for instance. But just to give you an example of the city of Pimpri Chinchwad, and this is the story across cities, they had barely 20% coverage of drainage network in slums. After 5 years, having leveraged the data that was created, they have moved to almost 69% drainage network coverage in slums. And from 8% home toilets in slums, it has moved to 55%, families in slums now having a home toilet. And that is a massive impact. So there was a lot of cost sharing, which also happened when this program rolled on the ground. But what was very exciting for me was that, data is never in the public domain. You and I don't even, you open up any website of any government, you'll hardly see any data. So one of the things that we had built into our memorandum of understanding with every city is that when you validate this data, we will put it up on our website, and you should link your website to our data site, which will bring data into the public domain. I think in a way that, gave them that confidence to do that simply because they were co-creators of it. And one important thing which I thought, which I would love to share with everyone, is that it busted a lot of myths. Where the sanitation space is concerned, every city across the country only gives community toilets as the only solution to slum communities, right? When we did our data, first round of surveys across these cities and across the slum, they were very taken aback when they saw that over 70% families said, yes, we want a home toilet. It was a demand that governments had never been able to capture simply because they had never bothered to gather data. And I think the COVID situation in a way has given them a huge scare, because one thing that is seriously lacking is navigable data. Today, the cities have had no means of tracking and monitoring COVID patients in slums, which has led us to now partnering with Google to give digital addresses to every hut, which can be then navigable on Google Maps. So this is something that we are trying very hard to do. And I think all these efforts is really now towards making government hold the data. And that's it's another story altogether, because you can't have NGOs or consultants doing this, because every time there's a change in government, you reinvent the wheel. So one good thing is that we've at least put it out in the public domain. So no city manager can say that there's no data with us, because it's already there in the public domain. But I think the real challenge is, how do you get the government to hold data? Because we're talking about smart cities. If you don't have smart data, driving smart solutions, you're never going to have a smart city.
That's a very interesting thought on government. And I actually have another question on the government data, and we will bring in Santosh and we will ask him this question on how do we build these systems. I will now bring in Rikin, the founder of Digital Green. Rikin's journey started inside a digital lab building solutions for rural communities. What's fascinating for me about their work is one of their key principles is of the community for the community. So Rikin, tell us a little bit about your journey and why community is at the center of your design, be it empowering them through data or getting them access to their own data.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with this panel. So our work at Digital Green primarily involves working with government agricultural extension programs that are involved in training rural community members, especially women, on ways to improve their livelihoods and in agriculture specifically. And the way that we do that is by building on the existing social fabric that these community members are already sharing information with one another. And that is, they already share information about what crops they grow and how they grow them with their neighbors and with their family members informally. And we essentially digitize that by enabling the community members themselves to produce short 8 to 10 minute videos that are by farmers and for farmers, which really represent essentially the most participatory form of data storytelling of these individuals to build on these existing social networks and to enable individuals to become role models for their respective peers. You know, the first questions that individuals ask when they watch these videos is often not about the economics of these practices, but what's the name of the person in the video? Which village is he or she from? To establish trust and identification with these peers to say that if this person can do it, then I can do it too. In addition, we, with our government partners over the years, have ended up building various types of data management solutions. We work with more than 2 million odd small scale farmers, and more than 95% of them are women. And this data collects information about which individuals watched what video, what questions or feedback they expressed, and what practices they adopted or didn't apply on their farms after these video showings. And historically, this data has been pretty centralized in the MIS systems of government, primarily for monitoring purposes. But of course, there is, you know, as previous speakers have shared, there's a real opportunity to flip this such that the data is controlled by these individuals themselves, and so that they can express agency over them, especially as the agricultural ecosystem in India has changed so dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years, right? There's more than 1,000 agri-tech startups that have garnered more than $1.5 billion worth of venture capital investment, brought a lot of new talent and financing into the space. But everyone is working in independent silos, and there's real risks around data aggregation and dominance that could use data in a more exploitative fashion, in addition to the fact of lack of coordination amongst organizations in the sector, and the fact that there's a real chance that marginalized populations, again, especially women, could even be further marginalized with technology and data. And that's where we're building an architecture called FarmStack to enable individual farmers, as well as organizations that work with farmers, to be able to codify the types of data protections that are needed to ensure that the data owners really have their rights established right from the get-go.
Hey, thanks, Rikin. And I think there was, in the chat box, somebody had asked about agri data, and especially farmers' data, and how it is not working for the farmers. It is working for everybody else in the ecosystem, but not for the farmers. Was also another conversation about collaborative data. And so on that note, I will invite Santosh. Santosh is the Vice President at NASSCOM Foundation, which is the social arm of NASSCOM with a mission to drive technology for social good. So Santosh works with businesses, governments, and social sector to build capacity, influence policy, and create thought leadership. Santosh, couple of things that came out when Pratima was talking and when Rikin was talking. One is, what role does government play in bringing together these different data points? and exposing them either to the public directly or to the innovation networks. How do you see government playing a larger role in that? Maybe also as your perspective of bringing together ecosystems from businesses as well. If you could also cover the role of government and businesses in creating a vibrant data for good ecosystem, that would be wonderful.
Great. Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Dasra, for inviting me here. And I think there are a lot of things that I need to compartmentalize. One, let me start with what we are doing with the government. So I think increasingly, one of the things that we've been able to prove to the government is that there is a merit in working together. So, when COVID struck, NASSCOM put together a task force, and we brought in these companies to say, how do you deliver better results? And we worked with the government on different data sets, and we're able to create a tracking mechanism, which most of the state governments took up as the data point for most management of this entire situation. Having said that, we are making headway into the government systems to ensure that whatever data they collect come onto the public domain. So one of the examples is from Telangana. So if you look at Telangana, Telangana has an open data forum. And right now, Telangana Open Data has about 192 data sets from different departments. They're slowly opening out, the data that has been collected over the years for organizations to use. So when I say organizations right now, there are two things that we are trying to do. One is, how do you get the young social entrepreneur, or the social entrepreneur interested in data or working with the data? So what we are trying to do with the government is create sets of hackathons where we are able to expose young entrepreneurs to the new data sets that are available on the domain. While some of them, as most of you pointed out, will be dated, but there are some very critical data sets that are available that one can use to build their innovations on. So that is the conversations that are being driven right now at the government space. And we are also seeing it, that the example of open innovation, perhaps, is that something that we've been trying to drive. If you look at the corporate history itself, they say the open innovation has never been a natural muscle. It's an acquired skill that one needs to exercise. So I think that is a conversation that right now is happening, that, how do corporate themselves use that entire open innovation forum to ensure that they have results that they can use both in the business and also ensuring that better outcomes for their clients. So that is the conversation that we are trying to see is, can we bring those insights into the whole development space and see how we can bring together, philanthropists and other organizations to invest in skills that are, helping open innovation. So that is something that the NASSCOM Foundation is looking at. On the third piece, when we are talking about data ownership, I'm just taken back to the old social work days where, participatory rural appraisal or your social audit, played a very important role in actually the data collection and data custodianship, right? So, if we go that way, PR is used to empower communities to have decisions based on their own perception of what they require of the community. So, there is a shift that we are seeing with government where they are willing to open out data sets that are being collected publicly. I think one of the things that we also heard Lucy was talk about, the data literacy, right? No, I don't understand what data does for me. How do you develop that in communities and in people who will actually benefit from the data? So I think a lot of things have been said. So I would just think is that we are driving towards that government openness for data. Second, we are also needing. There's a need to help organizations to understand why they need and how open innovation can happen on data. And three is go back to seeing how community can be given back the ownership of data. So I'll come back and stop here.
No, I think that's an interesting question for both Pratima and Rikin to answer. But first, let me introduce the other two speakers, and then maybe we can do that conversation. So the other side of this innovation ecosystem is the funders, and you talked about them, Santosh, that who are the funders who are funding these innovations? So I want to bring our next speaker, Rekha Koita, co-founder of Koita Foundation. Rekha, how should funders incentivize organizations to open up or create common spaces of creating data and sharing data with not just with other innovation ecosystem, but also with the person whose data it is. Last time you had talked about moving from M&E to more trust empowerment type of models, and how as funders you are thinking about incentive structures that need to come in place for innovators. So it would be great to hear from you examples from your work around health and education, and what does funding data as an empowerment tool mean for you?
Thank you. Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Dasra, for having me here today. So our work is, primarily around enabling NGOs with digital transformation, digital tools, because I think, as you said, Priya, first, organizations need to have the data. Only then can they share the data. So the first step, as we look at it, like Pratima was mentioning, right, it's been a journey of the last 2 decades. I think every NGO goes through a journey, and the first step in that journey is for them to undergo that transformation to become data-driven. They need to be able to have the right systems, processes in place to be able to actually have the data to take the right decisions. So I think that is really the first step, which is what we talk to our NGOs about. And we tell them that we need to look at data to solve your business problems, right? So data is not just for the sake of having data or having technology, but it's to solve your business problem. So what is the business problem you're facing? And therefore, how can we solve it using data? So for example, we work with Magic Bus, which is a large NGO, and they had a lot of underlying systems, but they were still finding it hard to manage and monitor, their over 4 lakh beneficiaries in 22 states. So we helped them to put together a Microsoft Power BI system which started giving them, instantaneous data on what's happening on the ground. So when you know what is happening on the ground, then you can become more proactive. You get a comprehensive view of what's happening, and you are able to actually deepen the impact. So that's the first step: become data driven and be able to deepen your impact. Right? Because even, for example, in the maternal and child health space with FMCH, now they're implementing a decision tree app. They have implemented a decision tree app for the field workers. So in a way, you're also empowering the field worker, because the field worker now knows exactly what's to be done. It becomes more system driven. And also the people who are managing the whole program, right, are able to see what's happening on the ground. So when they have implemented the app, they realize that very often the visits which are done after the woman delivers the baby are all more focused towards the child, and there is not enough emphasis being given to the mother, which needs to be done on the ground. And these things you don't know unless you have the data. So I think that is the first part of it. And the second thing is, once you have that basic thing in place, and also I'd like to just make one point to incentivize NGOs, is also to realize that once you have this data, it is this data which helps you to tell the story. Right? With the data, you can tell the story. With that story, you can go to funders so that you can get more funding, you can scale, and again, enhance your impact. And the second is, you can use that data for advocacy. You can use that data to change the narrative. And then further build on the basics too. So the second stage, like with Antarang, we've done a lot of work over the last 3-4 years. And one of the recent applications we put in for them was a technology, a tech tool, which helps the beneficiaries who are the youth, the adolescents. This is for their livelihood program, where the youth can actually look at a customized, set of jobs which are available for him or her. So what happens is, you're changing the narrative from a centralized placement person trying to ask people to come for interviews and telling them, this is what's available for you, to saying that, hey, this is what you have. All the information is with you. Take charge of your life and go ahead. Right? And they can also then network with other peers who have worked in those same organizations. They can understand their experiences. So it becomes very empowering. Even in an organization like Arman, which sends messages to pregnant women, right? One of the feedback of the women from those communities are that they feel very empowered because they have that information now and they can take decisions regarding their own health, their children's health, immunizations. So there is a lot of, there's a lot to be done, and it's a journey. And I think what funders need to do is explain to organizations what that journey is, what are the different stages of that journey, and that it is ultimately only by having that data that you can empower yourself and empower your community, go into advocacy, and then that's how you can bring about social change, which is what they're all looking to do.
Thank you so much. I think interesting example of how do you let the beneficiary know what use they can, what can they do with the data that is available to them. With that, I also want to bring in Gayatri to bring in yet another funder's viewpoint. Gayatri is the CEO at AT Chandra Foundation. Gayatri, AT invests a lot in building capacity of organizations that you work with, and then enabling them to scale their impact through collaborations. And I think there was an interesting question about collaboration or collaborative alliances. Would be great to hear why funders should do that, and also would be great to hear of examples of scale or vibrant ecosystem from your own work.
Sure. So I think at the AT Chandra Foundation, we believe in data, right? We believe in making decisions using both heart and head, and the head can't function without that data. And I think what we see is that data not only empowers, and of course it empowers, like all of you have said, it also inspires. Data can also inform, right? And one of the things I thought I'll talk about, since nobody else has brought that up yet, is really how putting out data there can inspire similar models, can inspire somebody to actually do more than what you're doing because you've already put out that amount of data. And I think, when you talk about, I think Anant might call me prehistoric, but when we talk about M&E data for NGOs, we often try and push them to going from inputs that they measure to outputs. And I think the next thing needs to be about multiplying that impact through, inspiring others to do similar work. I'll keep this quick, but one of the examples I wanted to share was the Zero survey that we had co-funded in Mumbai. At that, when we needed to get it going, there was so much pushback, right? Like, why do we need to know how many people have already had COVID? And I know this is not a closed space, but we had pushback from across levels, right? From people whose blood needed to be taken, rightly so, it's their blood, their data, to the government, and different levels of government, because we need to get permission from everywhere to do something like this. And from other funders saying that, no, we are focused on COVID relief, but we'll do distribution of food, which is of course hugely important. I don't want to take away from that, but nobody was that excited about putting in money to get data. How we managed to get the required funding through other co-funders. We got the permissions on the ground, right from Niti Aayog to the BMC. And we made sure that the data was, accessed only by certain people who needed to have access. So the researchers didn't know whose data they're looking at. The lab didn't know what personal information, they only had the blood. What we were able to put out was that 56% of people in the slums have had COVID. That helped the government think about, okay, so what can we do now to open up, right? These people can go, housing society said, okay, maids and drivers can come back. Other cities started doing similar surveys to see what it'll do, what their data said and what they can do with that data. And, they had that ripple effect because we were able to put out a little bit. I'm going to stop there and answer other questions, but I just wanted to share this aspect of data as well.
Thank you so much. So Santosh, I will actually take 2 minutes and ask that question that you asked. Is from Pratima, Rikin, either of you, if you want to answer, is how does the user understand how powerful their own data in their hands is? What do you do to enable that understanding in the user? You are on mute, Pratima. Yeah.
Okay. So in this case, we're really talking about the government. who really needs to be using this data. First, who really needs to be holding this data. How do you get the government to hold data is really the key challenge, I think, which everybody must have faced. And so we are now, thinking of ways in which we can incentivize this. So for example, in one of the cities where we did a lot of sanitation, across slums, we were pleasantly surprised when the water department came to us and said, is there a way in which we can leverage this data? Because we are giving, metered water connections to every house, even in slums, but we have no idea what has been the outreach of that, right? Yeah. So now, when we picked up a thread from there and we said that really what needs to happen is that across departments, you need to have a common data platform, right? And I mean really across all sectors, because whether it's health, whether it's livelihood, whether it's education, whether it's services, everybody needs data, and especially of the vulnerable communities, which is just not there. So we were saying that, I don't know how many of you really walked through a slum and seen that typically on every door, you'll see at least 5 or 6 numbers. Now, these numbers have been given by various institute or organizations, government, non-government. I mean, anybody comes, does a survey, they put their own number on it. There's nothing on a common platform. So we are looking at, say plus codes become the unique location ID to which every department, links their data to that ID. That becomes the common thing which runs through, every department. And then you start sort of enhancing that, building upon it and holding it. But sometimes, for the government to be incentivized, if there's revenue coming out of it, maybe then they will start looking at it. So we are now looking at some of the department within the government who can maybe generate revenue, like, the taxes that they levy, it's a flat tax maybe for the poor, or the Shop Act, or whatever, water, metered water connection, solid waste management. So we're trying to see how we can bring this data onto a common platform. It's work in progress, so I'm not sure how successful we will be, but that is one way of maybe inviting the governments to start seriously looking at holding that data, because you need to regularly update it, because NGOs or consultants, whoever it is holding it, it's only a temporary arrangement. The moment, people move out, nobody knows, everybody's clueless where that data is, on which computer it's sitting. So I just think that we need to also very innovatively think about how we can get the government to hold this data. And we are just thinking of, means and ways of going about it. And these are a few thoughts that I've shared, which we're sort of trying out on the ground.
Thanks, Pratima. So we're running out of time. So what I would now ask each one of you to do is to take a quick 1-2 minutes to suggest to the audience, as their roles of entrepreneurs or as enablers or as funders, what are 2 things they should think about tomorrow morning when it comes to data for good. And you, maybe we'll start backwards this time. Maybe Gayatri, you want to start.
Sure. So I think my suggestion to NGOs would be, don't worry about data, even if it's not necessarily painting all the pictures that you want. We'll get there. But unless you put that out, you will not get people to help you get to the right answers and to help you to show your impact get better. And I think to funders, my question would be ask more questions. I know we get a bad name for asking too many questions, but at the end of the day, we're doing this work for the most marginalized person in our country, in our world, and that's who we should be answerable to.
Yeah, thanks. Rekha, would you like to chip in?
I think to funders, I would like to say that you must insist that your NGOs become data-driven, that they embark on this journey, and as they move along, they slowly also start empowering their own beneficiaries and their own field workers. There has to be something in it for everyone, across the value chain. And it's funders who have to insist on that and who have to have that perspective. That should be looked at, it should be looked at almost like programmatic funding from a funding perspective. I think that's one thing I'd like to say from the funders' perspective. And I think from the NGOs, I think honestly, data is the future for them if they want to grow and they want to achieve whatever is their vision or mission. So they have to just kind of go for it, is what I would say.
Yeah. Santosh?
So I think to NGOs, I think one of the things that you need to think about is adopting open data formats to see, how do you create interoperable data? I think that's some of those major challenges. And I think with, just coming from the CSR space, I know there are tons of platforms that connect data, and how interoperable they are, nobody knows. So I think that is one of those conversations that one needs to have as donors and an NGO, saying, the amount of data do we collect, is it optimal? Is it really needed? And is it on a format that everybody can use? So I think that's something that you need to think of when you start data.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Rikin?
I would say, for the types of communities that we work with, often they don't know even what data is, nor its potential value. But what I would say for NGOs, is that it's not too early to begin to think about how can data not just be used for monitoring purposes or for publishing to a website, but how can data actually be used by the communities themselves to have greater agency in their own sort of choices and development. And the value of not just open data, but the corresponding data protections and differential privacy and other types of requirements that need to be also considered to protect the interests of these individuals. And for funders to really also be vested not just in funding individual projects, but building some of these common data and digital infrastructure tools that can really support the wider ecosystem.
Thank you. Pratima, over to you.
When I heard Rekha speak, it really was like music to my ears, because Rekha find it so difficult to get donors to fund data. Nobody wants to fund data, and unless it is linked to a project. So I completely, totally agree with you that donors now should start encouraging NGOs to become more data driven. And from the NGOs perspective, I would say that, we all need to now start pulling in data also. A lot of NGOs keep data very close to their chest. There is a lot of, reluctance to share that data. I think we all need to try and see how much we can bring our data onto, a platform where we can all share it and make our own projects richer by sharing data. And I really feel NGOs should start doing that now.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of you that one is that we are all collecting different types of data for the same user, and we are all starting from scratch. So if there was a platform where we could actually share the data about the same user, a third person may not need to go and do this again. So thank you all of you so much for a very interesting conversation. I know we didn't have time to take questions, but there are some very interesting questions in the chat box. There was one around languages that I really wanted to pick up, but we couldn't. So if one of you or all of you could answer that question, would be really interesting. I will now hand it over to Tarun. Tarun is the Regional Data Manager, APAC at Bloomberg LP, to take us to the next session.
Thank you, Priya. I was having some technical difficulties earlier, so I hope those have been resolved and you can hear me fine now. That being said, when I was hearing through, when I was listening through some of these conversations, two quotes came to my mind, right? The first quote was, "Don't let perfect get in the way of good." Which essentially just says that, we got to get started. We got to get to a point where at least we have a minimal viable product rather than striving for perfection from the get-go. That can be an eventual goal. And the second thing, which obviously in Bloomberg we always use, as an inspiration is, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data. So those are two things that consistently come to my mind as I hear as I hear some of these conversations, and it was very entertaining, very interesting conversations across the board, from the funders, from the, NGOs. I'd like to take a moment to thank all the participants and all our partners and speakers for helping bring this initiative to life. We've had a strong start, this evening, and I'm sure that we're well placed to bring about meaningful change across the board in India, and actually give agency to the people who need it the most, right? Now, if you look at what's happening, I think, companies, consumers, organizations, governments, they're all digitizing very rapidly, not only in the innovative sectors such as, online learning and gamification, but also in traditional sectors like banking, finance, food delivery, even as a case in point. And a huge part of this is the accessibility and democratization of the internet. Right, it was heralded by the internet companies, obviously, like Geo, and the traditional sectors like banking, like even cement, like tires, are seeing how important this has become. So as the digitization happens, more and more data is now available across the board, right? So digitization and data really go hand in hand here. Right, even gold can be bought, as a virtual security rather than actually having to go to a jeweler and actually buy it, physically. There is a long way for us to go to have government data available publicly across the board, but there have been a number of organizations that have started different initiatives, as was made as the conversation has led us to talk through, right? Data.gov.in has data for villages that have amenities in Manipur, in Tamil Nadu, and things like that. So there are a lot of different places, and consumers also have options now, right? So, when we talk about all of these things, right, when we talk about mobile phones, when we talk about internet, it's all last mile users, right? So what about the first mile? What is important for us is not just in giving people the ability to consume due to accessibility and digitization, but also shape the future of this data. And I think that is why we're all here today, to figure out and to have a conversation around, how can we give users the ability to shape the future of this data? How can they have agency in not only having this data, but also saying, like, what kind of data, and how can they access it, right? So that ability to see what is available is just the first step in ensuring that the data is used for the good of the people. They have to have a say in creating what matters to them, right? So these is just some of the reasons why the Data for Good is so exciting for us. This is a platform that can help springboard the innovation for last mile users, and ensure that users do not just have accessibility, but also agency. I have obviously been monologuing for quite a while. So, with that, I'm pleased to introduce the Data for Good Empowerment Challenge. It's a unique challenge that will recognize and support 3 driven social innovators who are using data to create transformational change. All right, fantastic. Yeah, so as I was saying, very pleased to introduce the Data for Good Empowerment Challenge. It's a unique challenge that will recognize and support 3 driven social innovators who are using data to create transformational change for vulnerable communities through early stage projects. These data-led innovations will include, designing universally acknowledged actionable metrics for the social sector, empowering vulnerable communities with data through participatory action, creating feedback loops that enrich a common data platform, and strengthen the sector by breaking out of siloed data systems. All of the challenges that we've actually heard through the different conversations that we've heard today. Finally, the Data for Good Exchange Empowerment Challenge will award 3 exceptional innovations incubated within successful Indian civil society organization by these datapreneurs with growth capital, mentorship support, as well as catalyzing networks to further their journey towards data-led empowerment. With that, thanks everyone, and it was great to hear everybody. With this, I'll pass on to Urmi for some closing thoughts. Urmi, over to you.
Thank you, Tarun. And I think just wanted to reflect on a lot of our conversation today that's focused on how we can harness data in the service of society, the roles for different stakeholders to play in achieving this, and how we can create an enabling ecosystem for innovations and platform building. This is only the beginning of the journey for us, and we hope to stay engaged with this group and the stakeholders here and catalyze very clear actions towards data empowerment. And I think as one of that, along with the challenge, we wanted to also reach out and say, if you are making data or technology investments as a funder or implementer, and you'd like our support in thinking through, how to enable that virtuous cycle of data, we'd love to chat. And please do reach out to us on the email address you see on the screen. I know we're at time. Before you log out, a quick request to please fill a quick feedback form. I know it's late for many of you, but it should only take a few seconds. And I think finally, as we close, a very, very big thank you to all our speakers for today, and mainly to all of you, our audience, for staying so engaged, not only tonight, but also through all of the different sessions across DPW over this last week. We look forward to seeing you all again as part of the Data for Good journey, but also at DPW 2022. Stay safe, and good night and good day. Thank you.